Anyway, so tonight Ian is, if you don't remember Ian Sacs, he comes to us as a volunteer, and he's doing this out of the goodness of his heart, helping us. So first, before we get started, I really want to thank him. He's going to walk us through everything that came out of the workshop that we did about 6 weeks ago. So he's put together for us a report on short-term action items and long-term action items. But just in general, I really want to thank Ian, first obviously for walking us through this workshop, putting together the report. He also has taken time off from work and gone with me to meetings with Jersey City and with the county to figure out how long-term we can create an alternate route for Patterson Plank. And as many of you may know, he's also helping with a proposal for bike lanes in Hoboken. So he's a real asset to our community. And in his professional experience, he is working with New Jersey Transit on some of these other issues. So really want to thank him. So he's going to introduce, basically short-term, long-term action items for us. This is going to be a living, breathing document that we're already working on doing a lot of these things, and look forward to your input. Thank you. Okay. Turn over to you.
All right, so it's pretty, most of you were, I think almost everybody, it looks really weird.
That's right, okay.
I have to, actually, you know what? I'm limited by a no extension cord, and so sorry. I think almost everyone here was at the first workshop, which was in April, and the purpose here is, there's this development, and this existing development already happening in Southwest Hoboken, and there's going to be more development in the future. The existing industrial and commercial uses don't really represent what the future type of development is going to be, so there's a switch in the way that the public space, the road space, and other public space is going to be used in the future. Right now, the roadways currently just move traffic in and out of Hoboken in that southwest area. It's starting to change a little bit. More people are getting out on the streets, but that's how a lot of people perceive that, especially people who've been living here for a long time. In the future, there'll be a residential and mixed-use developments, and that's expected to increase more, kind of pushing out the industrial and commercial uses to some extent. And there needs to be this balance of traffic operations in the future, that better balance between that existing use of getting traffic in and out of Hoboken, but at the same time accommodating the future residential and mixed use to feel the area more in line with what the rest of Hoboken is. So with those kind of concerns for Southwest Hoboken, Dawn had asked me to assist in this process of getting the community's input, all of your input in the ideas on how to make that area better and how to kind of fold it into the walkable feel that most of the rest of Hoboken has. So in April, we had our community workshop. It was on a Tuesday evening where we sat in different groups, addressed specific issues like park space and traffic and pedestrian bicycle needs. Those different groups came up with a long list of ideas. All those ideas were recorded. I took all those ideas and compiled them into sets of concepts that were, in general, short and long-term action items. But then you could also classify them in terms of traffic, parking, public space, and so forth. Some of the same ideas came up in different groups. Some groups had original ideas that weren't discussed in other groups, so I tried to compile all those. And this is a really great document, not just because I wrote it, but because it's a compilation of all these different ideas coming straight from the community that the city can now use and move ahead on, and it's a very valuable group of information. So those ideas are compiled. We're here now presenting a summary of those ideas. They're compiled in a memorandum. It's about 5 pages. It's brief. It just gets to the point, which is the short and long-term action items that were found. What we're hoping is that whoever's interested will take a copy of this memorandum, look at it in more detail, because this presentation just briefly summarizes those ideas. And make sure that we didn't miss anything, that things that are priority are highlighted in here, and that all of your ideas and concerns were taken into consideration. And then the next steps are to see how the Transportation and Parking Subcommittee and the city itself wants to take these ideas and move forward in incorporating the recommendations from the community, your recommendations, into the future steps that the city will take towards dealing with the traffic and open space concerns. So, a summary or a rundown of the short-term action items. These are things that take little or no planning or effort to start implementing right away. Starting out with, we heard a lot of discussion about the enforcement of illegal parking, people who aren't stopping properly at stop signs or rolling into crosswalks, or parking in crosswalks, unnecessary honking of horns at certain locations, talking on the cell phones. There's a lot of enforcement concerns that probably because of the industrial nature of that part of the city have been overlooked for a long time, and that now as that becomes more of a lived-in area of the city, enforcement is more of a necessity in that area, just as it is in other parts of the city. An effort to improve the pedestrian visibility in crosswalks. Just back up to the first point, the parking is not just illegal parking on the street, but also parking on the sidewalk. So there's this clearing of the sidewalks and returning it back to the pedestrian use, which is what it's intended for. There was this need to communicate to drivers that this is a pedestrian area. So one of the comments that I heard in my group was that as people drive into the city, they don't necessarily register that this is a walkable pedestrian area until they get past the first few streets. And so there needs to be ways to communicate this, and that can be done via signage, via the way that the streetscape is designed, and those things can be considered as the development moves forward. Reviewing of parking policies, pricing of permits, and promoting car sharing. We heard all of these ideas as ways to reduce congestion, reduce traffic, and either free up or ensure that there's future availability of parking spaces in the area. Collaborating with private landowners to share space. There was an interesting complementary set of ideas from different groups where everybody was looking for ways to make certain spaces available to everyone, even though they're private. Some of those places were, for example, Connor's parking lot. That could perhaps be used as something else, such as a playground. 401st Street, it's a senior garden, but it's not publicly accessible, and there was an idea like, why couldn't that space be made more publicly accessible so there'd be more interaction with seniors, as well as the benches in front of 200 Adams Street. And so there are other private lots, for example, those that are adjacent to some churches that perhaps could be used more regularly, more in complementary uses. Identifying areas to expand public space, include public space in all Southwest plans. There's been some great progress on that over the past couple of weeks. Most of us are aware of the progress that the city's been making in ensuring that there's public space included in the plans for Southwest. And this is echoed in the comments that we heard in April. Including Southwest Hoboken and the ongoing bicycle master plan effort. This is a bit of a twist of what was actually said. There were comments that said that Southwest Hoboken should be included in bicycle and pedestrian friendly efforts. But as most of you know, there's a strong effort going on right now to push for a bicycle plan and bicycle routes and lanes in the city of Hoboken. And so I'm just kind of rephrasing this slightly to say that this should be included, this idea should be, this area, Southwest Hoboken, should be included in this ongoing plan effort. Collaborating with the Hoboken Fire Department to open Madison Street from Newark Street. In my group, I was fortunate enough to have is he the existing commissioner, or is he the
Fire chief,
the current fire chief, who said that with a few small concerns that from what I understood could be easily addressed, the fire department would be willing to listen to the idea of opening up that section of Madison Street. And that's really critical because that's another way to get into Hoboken. If you've heard me talk at all about access in and out of the city, whatever forum that may be. One of the big challenges in South Hoboken is that there's really, when you're trying to get into the city, you've got Jackson Street or Park. So there's really only those two options to get into the city grid. And opening up Madison would create one more access point, and that would alleviate some of the pressure at those other two locations. And considering more on-street parking along Observer Highway to calm traffic. As this area of the city becomes more pedestrian friendly, becomes more lived in, becomes more walkable, one way to change the perspective of drivers of this area is to change certain streets back to more of a community feel that's consistent with the rest of Hoboken. And in places along Observer Highway that currently operate as a highway or just as this conduit to get vehicles from one place to another, there are opportunities to put in on-street parking. Yes, that will slow down traffic. Yes, that will add to a little bit of the impedance of traffic in and out of the city. But that's part of the balance between the public space and the conversion of this area of Hoboken into a more livable area, and also balancing the conduit of traffic in and out of the city. So these are all short-term action items that require very little effort to be implemented and can be done in a short amount of time. As far as some of the longer-term action items that were heard and reported in those in the different groups, first on the list is to identify and study the possibility of new traffic signals. As far as pedestrian safety goes, the crossing of certain streets can be significantly enhanced if pedestrians have their own crossing signal. And there are certain places where the traffic volumes are high enough that those signals could be warranted. It's just a matter of collecting traffic volumes, running through a simple process of determining what combination of volumes result in a signal being warranted. That's the technical term for being allowed to be installed based on national standards, and then designing the installation of that signal. There's a cost associated with that. The design process takes a little bit of time, but a lot of those locations could be done in collaboration with the county. So there's an opportunity to do that, and it doesn't take a huge amount of effort to do. Traffic-specific guidelines for the impact of new projects in Southwest Hoboken. As development occurs, there's an opportunity to be a little bit stronger in terms of asking those developers to identify what the effects of their development will have on the traffic and what they will do to try to ameliorate those traffic, any type of impacts that they have. It's a fairly simple process that can be done. It's not an expensive process. For the developer and for the city, it's just a matter of saying we want more. We want some sort of documentation to demonstrate what the effects of your development will have in this area. Study ingress, egress options and solutions for major bottlenecks. Probably the topic that sparked the whole intent of this workshop and the discussion is the fact that there are bottlenecks in South Hoboken, and the majority of them come from vehicles entering and exiting through that one section of the city. When we talked about ingress and egress options to begin with, I was just talking about them earlier, the fact that there are very little ways to get in and out of the urban grid. And I started out by these small sketches, and I can pass these out to anybody who wants to see them, but we're basically identifying the fact that there are very few places to get in and out of the city, and if it were possible to open up more access to the city, it would really distribute the concentration of traffic that happens at
this one that I'm handing out to is all 6, so if you want to.
Okay. Is this the one that says exit options?
This one has the entering options.
Okay.
From Henderson Street, which is really Marin Boulevard.
Right. If there were a way to open up Marin Boulevard, then there would be a lot more ways to get into the city. And the reality is that people who live in the city don't all live on the western side of the city or on the eastern side of the city, but those are really the only two places that you can get to. So you either have to come in on the western side of the city and then filter through the streets, or you have to come in the eastern side of the city and then double back. It's your choice, whichever one you think is quicker. But opening up access into the city, Jackson, you have Jackson Street already. if Madison were made available, and then if Marin were made available, then you could get to Adams and to Clinton streets. That would really reduce the amount of congestion at any one particular location. And I've said this in other forums, and I'll just repeat it again here, that the volume of traffic, of vehicles, the number of vehicles entering the city, trying to get in, for example, at Jackson Street, is not really high. It looks really high when you're sitting in that queue or you're trying to get around them or you're trying to make that turn. It's not really high. It's like, at the peak I've seen it, the worst times, 40 or 50 cars. That sounds like a lot of cars, but from a traffic engineer's perspective, it's not a lot of cars. The real challenge is the fact that there's opposing traffic and those cars can't make the turn, so you're waiting a long time. If you distribute those 40 or 50 cars to 4 or 5 different locations to make those turns, 10 cars in an hour's time is not a lot of traffic at all, and it would almost vanish. So opening up access to the south, to the urban grid of Hoboken, somehow, some way, would dramatically improve the existing congestion that we all experience in this part of the city. Considering closure of unnecessary roadway segments, there was some talk, particularly with respect to the development plans for the open space or the park in Southwest Hoboken, that there are some segments of streets that may or may not be as useful as they are now. It's very much worthwhile to look into whether or not certain segments of streets should continue to remain open. Are they more of a cost or a detriment to traffic operations than they are a benefit? Particularly those intersections that create a five-legged, street segments that create a five-legged intersection. Those are the ones that you really want to target to see if they are really necessary anymore. Because if you get rid of that one leg and you normalize that intersection to 4 legs, the operation of the signal improve dramatically. And you also gain back a lot of space for sidewalks or for public space.
What specifically roads are you talking about, unnecessary roads, anything specifically?
Well, it's not my place to say whether our street should or shouldn't go, so it needs to be studied, but what was discussed at the workshop was the segment of Patterson Plank Road between Jackson and Monroe. So as it intersects with Observer Highway, that small segment, it's kind of hard to envision, and I don't think we're going to, but everyone has a map, so it's fine. So you can see it.
It's actually Jackson Henderson section, right?
What's that?
It's the Jackson Henderson section, or the, actually, it's not even that. It's Harrison. It's the Harrison.
Between Harrison and Jackson, right?
It's actually Harrison Marshall.
Sorry, Harrison and Marshall. Yeah.
So furthest one up.
Yeah, there are several locations where Patterson Avenue intersects at an angle, and there's a potential to close those segments if a traffic study were to demonstrate that it wouldn't significantly impact the traffic operations, or if the impact of those to traffic operations was an acceptable cost to return to the benefit of either more open space or improved operations at the remaining signals. Consider partial or full closure of streets adjacent to the park. There were lots of discussions about closing either portions of Harrison or Jackson Street where they cross over the park. Closure may be the right idea. Partial closure may be another idea where that street becomes something less auto-centric and more park-focused, such as removing the existing asphalt and revealing the traditional cobblestone, or maybe raising that cobblestone up 6 inches so that it's at level with the curbs, so that actually the cars come up into that area. That's called a shared street, where cars are allowed to use that space, but they're sharing it with pedestrians and bicyclists. It's kind of like a park space, and they travel through it quietly. It's kind of like Hudson Place, south of River Street, where you drive into the Terminal Plaza and turn around. But that area is only low in volume because there's no through traffic. But if you can envision that type of street environment, narrower street, on one of these streets where cars have to come up into it, that would dramatically slow down traffic and create a shared environment where you wouldn't be eliminating the access concerns, which is typically the biggest gripe when it's recommended to close a street. You're limiting access or you're preventing me to get from one place to another. So a shared street option is a way of balancing that, particularly if the park is going to span across that street. Focus on pedestrian connectivity at park spaces. This was something that was written in all the different groups. As you get closer to a large park, the priority for pedestrians becomes larger, and so the design of the intersections and the sidewalks heading to the park becomes more of should be more pedestrian focused, more of a priority as you approach the park. Study separation of local and through traffic. Lots of concerns from all the different groups about the traffic that travels through Hoboken from other jurisdictions to get to or from the Holland Tunnel as a shortcut. There are ways to address that, and in fact there's already been some significant effort on Dawn's behalf with Jersey City and Hudson County to look into how we can address that on a more global manner. Consider pedestrian and bicycle uses in design of improved streets. So as development occurs, as areas get improved, as streets get rebuilt or redesigned or incorporated into the future development, there's an opportunity to reprioritize pedestrian and bicycle uses to fit the more mixed-use environment that is anticipated in the future in this area. And so when those designs are happening, that's a great time and an efficient time to incorporate these concepts and needs into the streetscape. Collaborate with New Jersey Transit on the Hudson-Bergen light rail crossing traffic signal. Two groups raised concerns about the amount of time waiting at certain intersections. If someone wants to call it out, feel free. I always forget exactly which one it is because
Marshall
The light on
Street,
Marshall Drive.
It's Marshall. It's the signal on Marshall Drive that's right next to the crossing for the HBR. That's connected directly with the crossing to prevent people from getting caught near or on the tracks. But there's certainly an opportunity to address the time that and the wait time that's there. Yes.
I may be a little bit off the turf, but it's certainly relevant. Being an eyewitness from my unit there, right over there, about trying to get New Jersey Transit or whatever the powers that be to put up a gate there because the light doesn't seem to work. There's been a few accidents.
I asked them, I actually made a call because I went through, a friend was driving and the train was coming right at us, so I actually asked them to look into what's happening with that timer and whether it's working properly. And I'm also asking them about the possibility. They're saying that traffic-wise it's too difficult to put out the gate, but I'm with you. I'm concerned that something eventually
This way they all just
gonna
on the
happen.
horn at all crazy hours, people trying to sleep.
Has there actually been an accident where the light rail hit?
Oh, I saw it. I was right there. I was reading right out my window.
Yeah.
People drive into there once in a while. But that's
But
really.
no one has been killed yet.
That's
Yeah.
a big start.
That's what obviously we'd like to avoid, so. But yeah, I will, I'm waiting for, I'll follow up with them and try and get more of a clear response on that. I mean, the other question too, which I think I was talking to you about, is whether or not we can make it so that people can make that left.
The left turn on.
The left turn, because what's happening is people are trying to like go around and make a left, and it's just creating
We
more time.
should be able to do that when you say, Ian, it's not a county road, Marshall Drive. So that's within our purview to make that, we can make it left only and right only. We can do that. But I think, after this, we talk about the next step, but we'll go to the traffic engineer probably. That could happen pretty quick.
It seems to me that the operations at the adjacent intersection probably weren't entirely taken into consideration when the signal timing was developed for the crossing, and this type of side effect that is kind of difficult to anticipate in advance it's good to get that feedback and it's not too difficult to reconsider and make that system, make those two signals work better together. And then finally, developing a program to encourage transit use and alternative transportation. And we're feeling it all over with rising gas prices, but the idea of trying to help encourage people to come to Hoboken via transit or via other modes of transportation other than driving and looking for parking. I heard some people in my group say that when people think about going into Manhattan, they always think about taking the train. They like to go out at night or to go to a restaurant. They always are often thinking about taking the train as opposed to driving in. There's a reason for that, and there's no reason why Hoboken can't also try to encourage that type of activity. We get a lot of people coming into the city to enjoy the city, but they can choose to come here by car or by transit. They probably just don't know the benefits or haven't been thinking about those benefits. And but just to talk about that in a little bit broader terms, the experiences I've had with large-scale projects that have access to transit facilities. Just a campaign of awareness significantly can significantly switch people's preference from cars over to transit. It seems like a little bit of advertising doesn't really have that much of an effect. But if you've been on the PATH train over the past half a year, the Convention Center, the Devils Stadium, PATH has been advertising significantly to get to Newark by PATH, and it had a dramatic shift in the amount of people who chose to drove versus take the train to Newark. And Hoboken is an excellent place to take a train to, or bus to, if the idea came to mind. And this is one way to try to convince people that this is a great way to get here. What that does for locals is it alleviates some of the congestion and some of the parking issues that happen at certain times of the week. So that's a summary. Again, the memo itself is much more detailed. It lists specific locations. It describes some of the concepts in more detail. And it also is a great way for you to either add information or question or challenge some of the ideas that were brought up. I will say that some of the ideas that I felt were a little bit out of the ordinary or maybe not the most easily implementable, I kept out. So the memo isn't a comprehensive list of every single idea that came out of the public workshop. But I would say it's about 80–85%, which is pretty good, which means that most of the ideas that came from the community were logical, made a lot of sense, and they're typical for people who have familiarity and understanding of the area. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to use this. I mean, the city really has a checklist of things that they could pick from, a nice long menu of things that they could choose from to see what they want to move ahead on.
So we have hard copies to give everyone, and I'm going to send out emails so that everyone can look at it. But just following up on some of the things that Ian's talking about, especially with the traffic study, I do feel strongly that regardless of what happens with the development, I mean, we all know there's talk of big levels of development, that right now there are some changes that we could make. And I've actually, working with Councilwoman Bruno, I actually called, she got the number for me, and we reached out to, the city has a consultant who does transportation engineering, and so we want to sit down and talk to him about putting together a traffic study and figuring out how many of these roads can we open up, and can we possibly use the master plan that changes the direction. Actually, Ian, if you want to sort of walk us through the
Sure.
master plan proposal for creating more of a traffic flow. These are things that we could be doing sooner rather than later. Like you said, maybe it's not, to me it feels like the traffic is overwhelming, but maybe if we make some of these changes, it will start to feel better and be better for the whole community.